Welcome back, everyone, to another Educational Explainer. Today, we are doing a real deep dive into a truly fascinating subject, agricultural and rural policy theory. For those of you studying or working in public administration, rural development, or agricultural economics, you already know that creating policy isn't just about drafting a document, it's about shaping reality. So we're going to use a strict policy science framework to pull back the curtain and deconstruct this living, breathing ecosystem of agricultural administration, tracing it from the very moment an idea is sparked to the moment it actually hits the soil. But before we get too deep into the weeds, I want you to chew on this crucial question for a second. Why do perfect agricultural policy plans so often just fail out in the field? We see it all the time, right? A brilliant, well-intentioned idea is drafted up in the Capitol, it gets funded generously, launched with massive fanfare, and then when it finally reaches the local farm, it just fizzles out. It hits what we call the implementation gap. Today we are going to figure out exactly why that happens, and more importantly, how the best policies are actually designed to overcome it. To get there, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to journey through the policy science life cycle. First, we'll look at why ag policy is uniquely complex. Then we'll walk through the 4 core stages of the cycle: discovery, formulation, implementation, and evaluation. Finally, we'll look at how all these pieces connect into one endless loop. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, why ag policy is complex. Agricultural policy is fundamentally different from almost any other type of public policy out there. And what makes it so uniquely challenging is the sheer burden placed on it. Think about general public policy for a second. It might just focus on economic growth or maybe a specific social issue. But agricultural policy, it is inherently multi-purpose. It has to simultaneously manage markets to make sure farmers can actually earn a living, manage nature to protect our soil and water, and manage communities to keep rural populations from totally disappearing. And then add to that the massive natural uncertainty. You literally cannot legislate the rain. Put it all together, and you've got this incredibly complex policy environment where simple, quick fixes just do not exist. Moving right along to Section 2, discovery and agenda setting. It is absolutely crucial to understand that policies do not just magically appear out of thin air. They are actively constructed. To understand how an issue actually grabs the government's attention, we look to John Kingdon's famous multiple streams framework. Imagine 3 separate streams flowing independently of one another. You've got the problem stream, say a sudden climate disaster. You have the policy stream, where researchers have been gathering data and proposing solutions, like new smart farming tech. And finally, the political stream, like a recent election or a big shift in public mood. A policy window only opens when these 3 streams suddenly align. A crisis hits, the data is ready, and the politicians are willing to act. That's the brief golden moment when a new agricultural policy is officially born. But here's the catch. During this discovery phase, policymakers face a massive, massive danger: misdiagnosing the problem. There's a profound difference between treating a symptom and finding the actual root cause. If you frame the problem merely as dropping farm income, well, your policy is probably just going to be a temporary subsidy, a Band-Aid. But if you dig deeper and frame the root cause as structural cost issues and trade imbalances, suddenly you open the door to real structural reforms. How you frame the problem in this discovery phase literally dictates everything that follows. Which brings us to Section 3, formulation, tools, and goals. So, the problem is on the agenda. Now we enter the architectural phase, where policymakers have to carefully select their tools. And the secret here is actually knowing what you have in your toolbox. Christopher Hood categorized government policy tools into 4 types: information, authority, treasure, and organization. The absolute key to great agricultural formulation is creating what we call a policy mix. Take the transition to smart farming, for example. You can't just throw treasure, meaning money and subsidies, at it and expect it to magically work. You have to blend it. You provide subsidies to build the tech, sure, but you also use information to educate farmers on how to use it. You adjust authority to deregulate land use for smart greenhouses, and you set up organizations like local tech centers to support the whole transition. It's the blend that makes the policy successful. Now for the real test. Section 4, implementation, the field gap. Okay, so you've got a brilliantly formulated plan. Awesome. But a pristine theory drafted up in some capital city office building must eventually meet the muddy, unpredictable reality of the local farm. And this is exactly where we slam into the implementation gap. This is that persistent, stubborn disconnect between what the central government intended and what actually happens out in the field. As policy scholars Pressman and Wildavsky famously pointed out, a brilliant plan is completely useless if it fails during execution. Every single layer of bureaucracy, every local geographical difference, and every individual interpretation bends the policy just a little bit. By the time it reaches the farmer, it might look entirely different from the original blueprint. We usually look at this tension through two competing lenses. The top-down approach relies on central directives and strict logic. And hey, that's perfect for things like national food safety or quarantine standards where you absolutely need uniformity. But agricultural development, that often demands a bottoms-up approach. Rural communities are incredibly diverse. A policy that is an absolute slam dunk in a flat grain-producing region might be a total disaster in a mountainous, fruit-growing region. Successful implementation means you have to allow for dynamic adaptation based on actual local realities and what the farmers actually need. And that brings us to one of my absolute favorite concepts in public administration, Michael Lipsky's street-level bureaucrats. In the agricultural world, these are your local extension agents, your town clerks, your agricultural cooperative workers. Now, to the central government, these folks are at the bottom of the hierarchy. But to the farmer, they are the government. These local officials use their discretion, their deep local knowledge, and their expertise to translate those rigid, abstract policies into something that actually functions for real farmers on a daily basis. They are the vital bridge over that implementation gap. Next up, Section 5, Evaluation. Feedback loop. So the policy's out there in the world. Now we have to evaluate it. And listen, it is essential to realize that evaluation is not some punitive audit designed to punish failure. It is an indispensable mechanism for crucial learning and adaptation. To evaluate effectively, policymakers use the logic model flow. It breaks down exactly how we measure an intervention. You start with inputs, the money and staff you dedicate. That funds activities like running a new training program. Those activities produce outputs, like say 100 farmers completing the course. That leads to an outcome, like those same farmers increasing their crop yields, which ultimately drives the impact, the long-term revitalization of the rural economy. You have to measure that entire chain to know if the policy is actually working. Now, here is a massive trap that governments fall into all the time, confusing outputs with impacts. Outputs are super easy to count. Hey, we built a facility, we spent the budget, we checked the box. But building an agricultural facility doesn't mean a thing if it sits totally empty 2 years later because the local community couldn't afford to run it. True evaluation ensures that we aren't just achieving immediate physical results, but that we are driving genuine, lasting societal impacts that solve the root cause we identified way back in the discovery phase. And finally, Section 6, the endless cycle, continuous learning. As this summarizing quote really highlights, true agricultural administration is not a straight line. It's a continuous living loop. When we evaluate an impact, we generate brand new data. That data reveals new problems, which opens a new policy window, setting the agenda for the next generation of policies. This is what we call double and triple loop learning. We aren't just fixing minor errors. We are constantly questioning our fundamental goals and adapting to a rapidly changing natural and economic environment. To wrap up this educational explainer, I want to leave a provocative thought with all the students, researchers, and policymakers watching. Agricultural policy isn't just dry paperwork. It is a fascinating, high-stakes ecosystem. Every single task you do, whether you're collecting data, writing a brief, or talking to a farmer out in the field, is an essential component of this endless cycle. So where do you stand in this cycle? And more importantly, how will you ensure that you are helping to close that feedback loop to create better, smarter agricultural policy for the future? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep learning.